Yes. Welcome back to our last keynote and the last talk of the conference. We thought we'd leave the best for last, obviously. No offense, Chris, but here we go. So Karen is associate professor in philosophy at Hobart and William Smith Colleges. Her interests are in the philosophy of the internet, trust, social epistemology, philosophy of science, ethics, and feminist philosophy. She's widely published in places like Synthèse and Hypatia, and is currently writing a monograph for Oxford University Press. Hopefully you're still writing it, Karen, entitled Who Should Be Online? A Social Epistemology for the Internet, and that's under contract with OUP. And today she will speak about echo chambers, trust, and epistemic agency under oppression. Thank you so much, Karen, for joining.
Thank you so much, Belly. I really wanted to thank you and Abraham and Caitlin and all of the organizers for this really wonderful conference. I know it's a lot of work to put on things like this, and it's really nice to have an opportunity to get together while we're all separated and have a chance to talk. I also just really wanted to thank everybody for the amazing papers over the past 3 days. This has been a really great set of papers and conversations. I'm really feeling newly inspired by our field and really looking forward to seeing so many of these things come forward and be published, and look forward to talking to you all more in the future. So yeah, as Valerie mentioned, I've been working on this book. I actually just finished it and submitted it. So this is, yeah, thanks. This is really exciting to have a chance to talk about completely new ideas. I've been working on this book for years and years, and kind of bored of those ideas, actually. I can't wait for you all to read it. But I'm excited to get to have a chance to just talk about something completely new. So this is a work in progress. I think, as I mentioned with Lola and Daniel's really great talk, I think some of the points I make today will be echoing points they made. So hopefully that will spur some productive conversations. So here's kind of the outline of what I want to argue for. Give me a sec just to figure out some Zoom settings here. Oh, Zoom, too many buttons to push. Okay. So I'm going to try and identify a pattern that I see in internet epistemology that I'm concerned about, which is ignoring marginalized people in our discussions, in particular, ignoring the agency of marginalized people. I'm going to see how I see this pattern popping up in some of these discussions about echo chambers and epistemic bubbles and filter bubbles. And then I'm going to look at what happens if we draw our attention to epistemic agency under oppression. What do we notice that we might not be noticing if we're not centering marginalized people in our conversations? And then I'm going to look at, where do we go from here? How can we maybe do internet epistemology in a more inclusive way that might, I think, make some of our analyses a bit better. So here's the pattern that I see happening a lot in different contexts, right? So there's lots of bad stuff on the internet. We've heard a lot about it the past few days. If you spend any time on the internet, you're going to see problems. So there's concern spreads about a kind of set of practices that bad actors are engaging in. And epistemologists notice, there's not just moral harm or practical harm, there's also epistemic harm. I want to note that often the bad actors that our attentions are drawn to are often members of privileged or powerful groups. So we notice something bad happening and it has epistemic consequences. Step 2 is then folks identify, there's a structural feature of the internet that's used by these bad actors, right? There's some kind of affordance or feature of the internet that's being exploited by bad actors. Step 3 is then arguments are made that this structural feature is an epistemic threat. I don't have any problem with identifying epistemic threats. What I'm concerned about is often that's where the conversation ends, that this structural feature is just identified as a harm, as an epistemic threat. There's no mention of the ways in which the structural feature might also be being useful, especially for marginalized people. And then sometimes, I put this in parentheses, you see this more in sort of like popular discourse, but I do also see it sometimes in philosophical discussions. Then arguments are made, well, we need to change the internet and get rid of this structural feature altogether. Okay, so that's a common pattern. I'm going to give one example of where I've seen this come up. So concern grows about online harassment. And folks recognize that online harassment is not just morally problematic, but it's also epistemically problematic because members of marginalized groups, right, women, people of color, queer communities are disproportionately targeted for online harassment. And so communities which experience online harassment are less epistemically diverse, right? We see forms of testimonial injustice against marginalized communities. So step one, we see concern grow about this problem. Step two, folks then identify, oh, online anonymity, that's one of the things that bad actors are using, right? They hide behind fake accounts, or because they are using a username which is not easily connected to their real world identity, we have a lack of ability to hold them accountable for their actions. So step three, online anonymity is argued to be a threat, morally, practically, and also epistemically. Just as one example of this, we saw a lot of discussion of this again over the summer. I'm not really much of a sports fan, but after the World Cup, right, there was a lot of harassment of English soccer players, racist harassment. And we saw again in that discourse, the continuing argument that comes up again and again, the online anonymity is bad and we should get rid of the ability for people to be anonymous online. So that's where we see step four. So this is a pattern that I've argued against in previous work. I have a paper back in 2014 in Epistemic, arguing that anonymity actually has lots of epistemic benefits. And I just want to point out in these patterns, marginalized people are not being studied as agents. They're often, if they're at all being talked about, are being talked about as mere victims. So we're completely right in worrying about the ways in, say, online harassment targets marginalized people. And it's right to be worried about bad actors targeting marginalized people. But often in our analyses of how the internet is being used, marginalized people are only being studied as victims. So this pattern ignores how marginalized people use the structural feature of the internet, in this particular example, anonymity, in really useful ways. And we've heard some discussion of this earlier today. I think Erna made some great points about fandom, and Dean made some great points about autistic women, right? So there are lots of cases in which marginalized people need online anonymity as a structural feature or affordance of the internet in order to be able to participate securely, safely, and to be able to contribute their epistemic resources, right? So that was part of my argument in that epistemic paper, right, is that epistemologists should recognize that there are epistemic benefits to online anonymity and that there really are downsides to calls for online accountability. And for example, Facebook's real name policy is really problematic. Okay, so that's just one example of another way in which we see this pattern that I'm identifying. What is problematic is that ignoring the agency of oppressed people leads to bad proposals for solutions, like getting rid of online anonymity. These solutions, I think, are often incomplete at best, but oppressive and counterproductive at worst, right? I think there would be real concerns about the ways in which our online communities would be less diverse, more exclusive, more dominated by only people who are from privileged safe groups if we were to get rid of online anonymity. And just also, this is sort of a point that's always puzzled me about epistemologists, is that we're really good at thinking of counterexamples, and often our counterexamples are wild and crazy and hypothetical, right? So we're thinking about Getter examples where we're counting coins in people's pockets and these bizarre hypothetical examples. And I find it frustrating when I read papers about applied epistemology, where there are real concrete thousands of oppressed people who act as counterexamples to some of the claims that are being discussed, and yet that it doesn't really register and is not taken into account. So I think we need to sort of be good about using our ability to think of counterexamples and recognize as often many flesh and blood marginalized people who often act as counterexamples to some of the solutions that are being proposed. And so part of this talk is aimed at getting us to develop that more as a habit, instead of just only thinking about bizarre hypothetical epistemological counterexamples. And I think standpoint methodology is absolutely crucial to that, right? We just have to bake into our practice as epistemologists, starting our analysis by investigating the online lives of the oppressed and not just as victims. I think it's been really great, the influence of the epistemic injustice literature in our field, because it has drawn attention to the ways in which power and privilege shape knowledge, right? I think the epistemologies of ignorance literature has been really great. But we're still at a point where I think because of maybe the overemphasis on epistemic injustice, we're still just focusing on oppressed people as victims of epistemic injustice rather than as agents. And that's obviously not uniformly, but I would like to see us more as a habit also look at marginalized people as agents. Okay, so if that's the kind of overall pattern, let's zero in and see how I think this pops up in the debates about echo chambers and epistemic bubbles. So I'm going to draw on two really great papers. We heard a talk by T. I think his work is really useful here. And I'm going to draw folks' attention to a really great paper by Jennifer Lackey. Her paper is called Echo Chambers, Fake News and Social Epistemology. It's in the 2021 volume, The Epistemology of Fake News. So I will be drawing on her critique because she makes some of the points that I wanted to make in this paper. And then my sort of target is going to be Hannah Gunn and Michael Lynch's 2021 chapter, The Internet and Epistemic Agency, and that's in the Applied Epistemology volume that was edited by Jennifer Lackey. There's a lot I really love in this paper, but I'm going to use them as an example of where I think this pattern is popping up, and hopefully maybe push that in some new directions. So, okay, I will go over this quickly because at this point, I think in the conference, lots of folks we all know what these terms are, right? So I'm going to be drawing on T's useful distinction between epistemic bubbles and echo chambers, right? So a bubble is a social epistemic structure in which some relevant voices have been excluded through omission. So the idea here, right, is that some voices are not getting through, some information is not being accessed or read online or heard online, consumed. And here I want to point out, right, that there's two sources of this kind of filtering. T doesn't really like the term filter bubble. I find it helpful to just go back and forth. So I'm going to think of epistemic bubbles as filtering mechanisms and sometimes refer to them as filter bubbles. So there's two mechanisms of filtering. One, we make choices ourselves about who to follow on social media and which sources to consume, right? So I make active choices about who I'm going to follow, who I'm going to friend on Facebook, who I'm going to unfriend, which media sources I'm going to follow and pay attention to. So in that sense, I have agency over the information that is reaching me and the filtering mechanisms. But there's also non-consensual filtering through the use of algorithms, right? So the revelations from multiple Facebook whistleblowers have just been fascinating in recent weeks, right? So for the example that say Facebook was prioritizing posts which had the angry emoji 5 times more than posts which had likes, that was built into their algorithm for a while. I mean, that is absolutely an algorithm making a choice about what's going to enter into my social media feed. And I didn't decide that I would like to see more angry posts. Facebook decided that for me. And posts in which friends only said like are going to be filtered out or just not appear as much. Okay. Echo chambers, in contrast, are not about filtering out so much as issues of trust. So echo chambers on T's rough account are social epistemic structures in which other relevant voices have been actively discredited, right? So here, T is concerned about cases where trust within a group, within an echo chamber, is increased as a result of discrediting outsiders to the group. So it's also particularly interested in when that distrust is cultivated or manipulated, in which some members within the chamber actively work to increase distrust in those outside the group. And one of the things that T identifies is that members of echo chambers are insulated from various forms of counter evidence to core beliefs, right? If I have been taught to distrust people outside of my group, then when they potentially have evidence that undermines some of my core beliefs, I'm going to be less likely to trust it or take that evidence as evidence because I've already been preemptively set up to distrust the source. Okay. All right, so with that kind of background kind of setup, here's the version of this pattern that I've identified popping up within this discourse, right? So some of the problems, epistemic problems that folks are concerned a lot about are polarization and the spread of disinformation, fake news, et cetera, right? So folks have identified echo chambers and filter bubbles as structural features that are facilitating polarization and disinformation. So when epistemologists get concerned about people believing false things on the internet and the ways in which groups become increasingly polarized or are separated, the lack of common shared beliefs, the discourse has tended to identify the structural features of the internet that facilitate the formation of echo chambers and filter bubbles as causes of those. And then in step 3, folks argue, oh, well, that means that these features of the internet that facilitate these acts of filtering, mechanisms of filtering, and also systems of selective distrust are harmful. If you were to go the further step, then you would argue that the internet should be changed in various ways. So for example, getting rid of online personalization would be the conclusion from arguing that these are epistemically harmful. Okay, so if that's the pattern in this discourse, I want to just like raise an initial set of concerns about it by drawing on Jennifer Lackey's really excellent chapter. So one of the things that Lackey points out is that filtering itself is neutral. So if you're filtering out falsehoods and untrustworthy agents, filtering is veritistically valuable. In other words, it helps you form true beliefs. So as an epistemic agent, it'd be really great for me to have a whole bunch of fake news or false information filtered out. And so one of the lessons that she draws from this point is that purely structural critiques of how we gain information can lead to faulty, we're all in the same boat analyses. And I'll give you an example of a quote from her, this in the middle, but this idea that we're all in the same boat, we all have these filtering practices are bad, therefore we're all potentially in, say, epistemic bubbles. She wants to criticize this because we're not all in the same boat. It matters what we're filtering out. Some of us might be filtering out a bunch of false beliefs, and some of us might be filtering out a bunch of true beliefs. So Lackey argues it matters not just how we get our information, but also what we're absorbing. And I really like this quote. I've broken up into 2 parts. So she says the diversity diagnosis of echo chambers. So I'll just briefly say what that is. This is the idea that echo chambers are bad because they reduce the diversity of the voices that you're hearing. So that's the diversity diagnosis. Echo chambers are bad. They reduce diversity. So the diversity diagnosis of echo chambers lends itself to a we're all in the same boat attitude about consumption of information. Trump watches only Fox News for his information on climate change, and you read only the Journal of Applied Meteorology and Climatology. You're both in echo chambers because of a lack of exposure to opposing or diverse viewpoints, right? So this idea that if just filtering out of some voices is bad, the person who's filtering out Fox News, which is full of false information about climate change, is structurally in the same epistemic position as someone who's filtering out information in peer-reviewed scientific journals. She thinks that's not a very useful analysis of what's going on here, right? She continues, if you know that one source is highly politically biased while the other undergoes blind review and fact-checking, there's very little epistemic benefit to adding the former to your news cycle. So if I just go back to this again, I'm really concerned about some of these we're all in the same boat analyses. And as I think her example of climate change is really useful here, I also see this come up a lot politically. So a lot of the discourse about echo chambers and epistemic bubbles starts with examples of like cults or conspiracy theories, often right-wing, points out that these are really problematic epistemic structures, that people are not set up to trust reliable sources, that there's lots of false information being spread. And then they feel somehow compelled in sort of what strikes me as a problematic kind of centrist political move to say, oh, but of course there's probably, I'm sure that there are echo chambers and filter bubbles on the left, right? This is in US politics, this idea of like, we've got to be neutral and say that both sidesism, I find really problematic here. And I think one of the real lessons of socially situated epistemology is we're not all in the same boat, right? So if we think of philosopher who we lost this year, Charles Mills, really important work on white ignorance, like some of us are in echo chambers which are full of white ignorance, and others of us are not. These are not similar epistemic structures. So I think it's really important to avoid this kind of centrist both sidesism. And I think one of the ways that we get encouraged to do this is when we don't actually look at how marginalized people are using some of these systems of filtering and also selective distrust for actually epistemically good ends. Okay, so that's kind of previewing where I'm going to go. Okay, so I want to move on to seeing how some of these patterns appear in Hannah Gunn and Michael Lynch's chapter. I want to say I really like a lot of this chapter, and their account of epistemic agency has been really helpful for me. So here's what they take epistemic agency to be. It's taking responsibility for the changes that we make within our epistemic lives. So they argue that responsible epistemic agents recognize and respect the epistemic capacities of others, and they demonstrate willingness to learn from others. So let's just pause for a second. They're really interested in epistemic responsibility. And part of, I think, what is rightly motivating some of their arguments here is how can we avoid epistemic injustice and disrespect for knowers based on prejudice and stereotypes. So one of the things that they're concerned about is, hey, to be a responsible epistemic agent means that you have to recognize and respect the epistemic capacities of others. And you have to demonstrate willingness to learn from others. Okay, and what's useful about this is that, right, they're thinking that this broader notion of epistemic agency can be really useful. We have to think about all of the different things we do as agents that create change within our epistemic lives that affect not just our own epistemic state, but the epistemic state of others. So I like this, and I'm going to be maybe expanding this to include some other forms of epistemic agency. Okay, let's take their argument a bit further. Their argument in the chapter is one of these narratives, sort of like doom and gloom about the internet narratives. And there's lots of reasons to be doomy and gloomy about the internet. But I do like it when folks also add there are also good things, and maybe I don't have time to talk about them, but let's just note them. And that's not really coming out as much as I would like in this chapter. So their argument is that the internet can make it very easy to write off the contributions of others online as worthless and irrelevant. So they're concerned about how we, for example, dismiss others because of their picture, name, or political affiliation. They're concerned that often we're scrolling our social media feed, we see somebody, we make a snap judgment, and we say, this is their quote, "I don't have to consider the opinions of people like that." This, I think, really, and they mention it, really nicely plays into the epistemic injustice literature, where we might have concerns that people are dismissing others on the basis of stereotypes or prejudices. And they think the internet really facilitates these snap judgments. I don't have to read or consider the opinions of people like that, people who don't share my political views, for example. They argue that online personalization is harmful. Why? It limits the range of people we meet online, thus making us less familiar with a wide range of epistemic perspectives and reasons, right? So they're concerned about this filtering and how it makes us less familiar with people who are not like us. And they're concerned about isolation and how that leads to then polarization and then also spread of misinformation. They say when we are very isolated within circles of like-minded people, what can result is an alienation from people whose worldview differs from ours. So we become alienated from people. We think we don't need to listen to them. So their concern is that the internet makes it easy for us to do others a testimonial injustice and show them disrespect as knowers by failing to recognize them as equal players in the epistemic game of giving and asking for reasons. And they're identifying some of these mechanisms that set up echo chambers and epistemic bubbles as the reason why the internet is bad in these ways. So part of my concern here is, I just want to be fair to them. They're not advocating for the elimination of online personalization, so I don't want to suggest they're going to step forward in my pattern, but the message you get away from their argument is that online personalization is just a threat. There's no consideration of the ways in which it might be useful. And in particular, they don't consider the ways that marginalized people use personalization to support their epistemic agency. And given that epistemic agency is really the topic of their paper, I think that's important, and I want to have us look at that. So here's my account of parts of epistemic agency, which I would like to see talked about more. So I'm going to talk about 3 features. 1, epistemic agency also involves protecting my time and other resources for epistemic activity. 2, maintaining, sustaining, protecting my self-trust. And 3, sustaining my connection to epistemic communities. These are, I think, all important aspects of epistemic agency. And I'm going to argue that some of these mechanisms that folks are concerned about with online personalization and selective distrust are really important for these features of epistemic agency. So I'm going to go through each of these one at a time. All right, so let's talk about personalization and how it's used to protect people's time and resources for epistemic activity. So marginalized people use online personalization to protect their time from harassers, triggers, time wasters, etc. Right? So given that online harassment is disproportionately targeted against marginalized groups, right? Members of a marginalized population online have to spend disproportionate amounts of time weeding out the harassment, also dealing with the bombardment of triggering hate speech, false information, right? If we're thinking about issues of race, right? The amount of white ignorance that you encounter online as a person of color, right? For folks who also come from communities or have traumatic experiences, being triggered by something that you encounter online can really derail your whole day, right? And it's not just a matter of time, it's attention, its ability to think, its ability to use your epistemic resources to produce your own knowledge, right? So I think it's often helpful to think of marginalized people as often operating in incredibly hostile epistemic environments that often undermine their own ability to produce knowledge, right? If you're not constantly bombarded with information that attacks your identity, right, argues that you're not as good a knower, that what you have to say is irrelevant, right? It's so much easier to have time to just put what you think out there, right? So marginalized people spend a lot of time, for example, generating block lists, sharing block lists with each other, helping other people within their community identify harassers or time wasters, or people who are using imposter fake accounts to attack their community, muting terms, deleting friends. A lot of this management of one's online space so that you have the time to think and act and speak without being drowned out by hostile voices is an important part of one's time online as a marginalized person. And I think this is really important to protecting one's epistemic agency, right? If you think of epistemic agency as involving the ability to make change in one's epistemic environment, my ability to make change is hindered by all of this stuff that I have to deal with. So I have to use personalization to be able to filter that out. Second thing that I think is really important, and I think Daniel and Lola mentioned this briefly in their talk too, is self-trust, right? So there's been some great work in social epistemology about the importance of self-trust. I really like Nadia Alcazar's recent paper, right, where she argues that self-trust is central to epistemic agency. And for marginalized people, they often swim in an epistemic environment which is hostile to maintaining one's respect or confidence in oneself as a knower, right? When you're bombarded with information that people like you are not as intelligent or are deluded or don't know how to interpret your own experiences, right? It's often really hard to maintain a sense of self-trust that I have something important to contribute, that what I have to say isn't me overreacting or seeing things that aren't there, right? So maintaining one's self-trust in an atmosphere of often gaslighting, attacks on one's epistemic capacities takes work. And if you belong to a privileged group, often you're granted excessive credibility and often have an arrogant attitude, right? So blocking, muting, and actively cultivating distrust in those who would attack one's self-trust is an epistemically important work for marginalized people. So it's not just a matter of filtering, it's also learning to cultivate sensitivity to who's an untrustworthy voice. When they say people like you don't know what they're talking about, you need to be able to identify that as an untrustworthy voice. So this is where I think thinking of cultivating selective distrust in those outside your group can be actually really epistemically helpful. I think the way that often echo chambers are framed is that the trust that's being increased within the group is somehow often unwarranted again, I think this often operates from taking privileged people to be the primary people that we're thinking about. If you belong to a privileged group, then you do often have excessive self-trust, and it's bad for you to distrust people outside your group. If you're from a group which has tended to have your self-trust attacked, being able to cultivate distrust in those outside your group who are attacking your trust is actually really helpful. And here I just want to, just for the sake of it, go back to Annette Beyer, just because I just really want us all to think about, she's just my touchstone for this, right? So people in epistemology are thinking more and more about trust. And I think with some of the concerns about epistemic injustice, we've become very concerned about how lack of trust can be harmful. But Annette Beyer back in the 80s always talked about trust and distrust together. And she always argued that trust itself can be exploited, can be manipulated, can be oppressive. And so I think as epistemologists, it's very true that we need to think about the value of trust, but distrust also has incredible importance too. So here are just some quotes from her in the context of ethics that I want to just bring into our epistemic conversations. So she argues there are immoral as well as moral trust relationships, and trust busting can be a morally proper goal. In unjust systems, it may take fortitude to display distrust and heroism to disappoint the trust of the powerful. Trust is not always a good to be preserved. So thinking about echo chambers and concerns that we have people who are distrusting folks, it matters who's being distrusted. Are they distrusting experts who are reliable, or are they distrusting people who are spreading misinformation? Are we distrusting those who spread white ignorance? Or are we distrusting those from marginalized communities who actually have maybe a better understanding of racial oppression, for example? Trust is not a uniform good. And so if the echo chamber discourse is that it's always bad to have cultivated distrust, as I think sometimes people loosely fall into, I want to just throw up a flag that actually cultivated distrust can be helpful, especially for marginalized people in unjust systems. It matters who you trust. Okay, let's talk about my last feature of epistemic agency. So I want to argue that belonging to an epistemic community is a critical condition for epistemic agency. We're not isolated agents. This is the central premise of social epistemology, right? We need interlocutors, an audience, critics, supporters, shared resources. And I would also add a sense of purpose in order to be epistemic agents. So just thinking for myself and my primary epistemic communities like philosophy, I'm just so grateful for opportunities like this where I get a chance to talk to people, right? I need people whose work I can read. I need those shared resources. I need an audience. I need, I don't give talks in order to just get supporters. I also love to hear what are all the possible objections, right? All of this is really important. And I also need to have a sense that it matters, right? That we might think about sort of Helen Longino's points about the importance of uptake, that if I make a good point, someone's going to hear it. If I make a good criticism, that it might matter, that I can affect change in this community, that I'm not going to be dismissed out of hand. So all of these are important features of epistemic agency that we need to feel that we have a community that we can belong to and be a part of, and that it matters to be a part of this community. Okay, this is going to take a couple of steps to construct. I want to point out that I think some of the discussion about echo chambers and epistemic bubbles has, I think, a really faulty picture of communities as distinct, isolated islands. When we're thinking that, okay, a bubble, you're just within this bubble, there's a clear boundary, no information is getting in, or echo chambers, they're distinct, isolated islands. I don't think that's necessarily the most helpful picture for how online communities or communities in general work, right? I think communities are actually more overlapping, nested, that there are blurred boundaries. So for example, you might have one community which is in some ways distinct, but there's blurred boundaries. And I'm trying to represent, like here with my hands, there's a bigger, broader community and then a little sub-community in here. And the boundaries are pretty blurred. I don't know that it's often helpful unless we're talking about, say, like a cult, to think of communities as distinct, isolated islands. And I think the work on cults is really helpful But I have some concerns that we're getting worried about very extreme cases and then applying it to all kinds of online activity and saying that, oh, well, we're all in the same boat. It's like we're all in a cult. Well, much of our communities that we're in have extremely blurred boundaries, porous boundaries, and are nested within them. This means that, I'm going to argue for a second, we might want to think about how we might maintain smaller communities in order to actually maintain our connection to a broader community within which it's nested. So I'm going to kind of work on an example for this. So I think that cultivating distrust and filtering out voices from one part of a community can facilitate the drive or motivation to belong to a broader community. So I just thought, why not use myself as an example here? So there have been various points in my philosophical career in which, to maintain my desire to even be part of the philosophical community, I've needed to filter out and cultivate distrust in various parts of the community, right? There have definitely been times when I read certain online blogs or follow Twitter discourse where I've just been despairing, right? There's so much racism. Why is there so much rampant transphobia in this community? Why aren't people actually reading feminist philosophy instead of saying ignorant stuff about it, right? I mean, there's just been points in which I've just felt like, why be in philosophy? Why contribute to this community? And in order to maintain my desire to even continue publishing and being part of this community, I've just had to say, not following that blog, don't want to hear about it, not following those people. I don't want to know about the latest philosophical brouhaha that's going on because it's probably ignorant and going to enrage me and make me think that I don't even want to do philosophy anymore, right? So in that sense, filtering out, this is, I should have drawn a picture, like filtering out information about what's going on in the broader philosophical community, and also actively cultivating distrust in bad actors in our community. Like, you don't need to listen to them. They're ignorant, right? They don't know what good philosophy is. So when they say that philosophy like you is not, that you do is not philosophy, don't trust them, right? That filtering and spreading of cultivating distrust has actually been crucial to me maintaining my desire to be a philosopher and maintain my commitment to this community. And I think it's not helpful to think of me as somehow locked in a feminist philosophy bubble, right, where I don't trust people outside, but these boundaries are blurred. And some of these mechanisms of online personalization and cultivating distrust have actually helped maintain my connection to my philosophical community. And so if folks have actual other examples of this phenomenon, I would really love to hear of it. So to summarize this part, I've argued that online filtering, personalization, and cultivated distrust is an important part of the epistemic agency for marginalized people. And I think that the structural features of the internet facilitate this are not uniformly epistemically harmful, right? So I'm concerned about arguments that we're all in the same boat, that because we're all subject to these terrible forms of the internet, that we should only see this as an epistemic threat. Okay, so if that's my concern about a pattern, where do we go from here? So I think obviously standpoint methodology is crucial to what we do, right? Starting from the lives of the oppressed, thinking of them as not just victims, but also as epistemic agents is going to make our internet epistemology less incomplete, less oppressive. I want to consider that we also potentially move from purely structural analyses to analyses that center power. And this is one of my concerns about analytic social epistemology. We tend not to be so good at talking about power, right? There are so many tools within philosophy of race, feminist philosophy, right, queer philosophy that center power. And these are the tools I think are really helpful for where we go ahead, thinking about power. And here's just one example of that, right? Personalization, as I've argued, per se is not the problem. The problem is who has control over the means of personalization. So when I talked about filtering, I mentioned that there are two forms of filtering, right? There's one where the agent has control over the means of filtering. I choose who to follow, I choose who to block. And then there's algorithmic moderation. Algorithmic moderation is a problem. That's control. We need an analysis of power, though, to understand why that's a problem. These are being operated by large digital monopolies. We need a criticism of digital capitalism to notice the ways in which these algorithms are not being driven by epistemic concerns. They're not being driven by social justice concerns. They're being driven by profit motive. And we don't have, as people, control over the means of algorithmic filtering. So we need a power analysis of the fact that our internet is dominated by digital media monopolies, right? In order to criticize the ways in which personalization is being wielded by powerful groups in Silicon Valley against epistemic good. And I think we need to provide models for epistemic communities that put power in the hands of marginalized people. So instead of arguing that we're all in the same boat, I think we need to identify that it is not a level playing field. We're in different epistemic positions, and different kinds of structural features of the internet might be used by different agents in different ways. And we should attend to who has the power to control how those structural features are used, and we should be agitating for different structural features that put more hands in the power of marginalized people. So thank you all so much, and I really look forward to the discussion. Thanks.